In the 1994 movie Pulp Fiction, Samuel L. Jackson uttered the iconic line, "Check out the big brain on Brett." And he was right on the money. Brett did have a big brain. All humans do. And while it would make sense that our big brains evolved because smarts are a plus, it's not that clear cut. For one thing, brain size doesn't necessarily correlate with intelligence. And for another, there are definite downsides to big brains. So how and why did Brett's brain and the rest of ours get to be so big? Let's use our oversized brains and think about it together. Now, right off the bat, I want to point out that we're talking about brain size at a species level, not among individuals. Some of the most recent evidence suggests that in humans, brain volume alone explains only 2% of the variation in performance at cognitive tasks, meaning that it's not a useful tool to use in comparing smarts between individual humans. Instead, what we're interested in is why the average brain size for our whole species has gone up, and how we managed to do that. In the animal kingdom, the relationship between brain size and body size isn't exactly linear. Yes, as bodies get bigger, brains tend to get bigger too, but it happens at different rates. Smaller animals tend to have larger brains relative to their body size, and larger animals tend to have smaller ones. For example, mice have a brain to body size ratio of roughly 1 to 57, but rabbits are about 1 to 205. And for a much bigger example, African elephants have a brain to body ratio of around 1 to 1,165. To put that in perspective, if humans had the brain to body ratio of elephants, an 80-kilogram person's brain would weigh just under 70 grams, which is less than the standard deck of playing cards. While human body mass varies a lot, if we use the global average body mass of 62 kilograms, our brain to body ratio is around 1 to 47, which is even higher than the ratio for mice. We're definite outliers. And big brains can be big problems. One issue with big brains is that they require big heads. And in the case of babies, those big heads have to be squeezed through a pelvis in order for them to be born, at least in the case of vaginal births. Now, brain size isn't determined by the pelvis. As with a lot of things in evolution, there isn't a one-to-one relationship between brain size and pelvis size or shape. As with basically everything about life, anatomy is complicated. But there is some evidence that the combo of our big heads and the shape our pelvis needs to be for walking upright may be related to why we have higher rates of maternal and fetal mortality than other primates. So that's one strike against our massive noggins. The other issue is that brains require a lot of energy to fuel. Across most vertebrate species, brains use somewhere between 2 to 10% of an animal's daily energy, but our brains use a lot more energy than that. Our brains make up about 2% of our body weight, but account for 20% of our total energy used in a day. That's a lot of extra fuel to burn, which means that there must be some real advantages to outweigh that cost. And there's been a ton of research on how and why our big brains evolved. But there are a couple of hurdles in studying the evolution of brains, one of which is that they're notoriously squishy, which means they don't really fossilize. So when we're looking at the evolution of the human brain, we're not usually looking at actual brains. Instead, we can look at endocasts made by taking fossilized skulls and using them as a mold. When anthropologists filled them with material that hardens, they produce a 3D replica of the inside of the skull. Imagine the tray of glue your dentist uses to make impressions of your teeth, except filling up a skull. Endocasts can't really tell us anything about the internal structures of the brain or the tissue itself, but they can do a pretty good job of allowing us to measure brain volume and stuff on the surface of the brain, like comparing the size of different brain regions. Now, anthropologists can use technology like CT scans to create virtual endocasts without risking damage to fossils. And sometimes endocasts form naturally when something like mud fills the skull and then dries out. The Taung Child is one famous example of an endocast forming naturally, which is extra lucky since we don't have all of that individual's actual skull, just that endocast and some of the face bones and stuff. Endocasts like this one have shown us that over the last 6 million years, hominin brain size has tripled. Anthropologists think this started out as a gradual trend, but then bodies and brains got a lot bigger around 2 million years ago when Homo habilis and Homo erectus showed up on the scene. And then about 800,000 years ago, the rate of growth for our brains shot way up. So something must have happened that gave our ancestors a boost to brain size around that time. One idea is that humans' extended childhood and parenting time compared to other species allow our brains to grow bigger. That extended time is needed not just for brains to grow for longer, but also for our neurons to make more complex connections. Plus, it gives time for little ones to learn important survival skills, from hunting to socializing. But this is also sort of like a chicken and egg question. Did longer parenting times allow big brains to evolve first, or did recently evolved big brains require the development of longer parenting times? There's also a question about energy. Think of energy like a budget. We have our money that's available to spend, which in this analogy is our basal metabolic rate, or how much total energy we use just by existing. Then we have our expenses, or all the different parts of our body that we need to spend that energy on. If you want to increase the amount of energy available to allow for a bigger brain, you have two options. Increase your salary or move money around from one expense to another. In other words, you can increase your basal metabolic rate or make something else less energy intensive so you free up energy for your brain instead. This is where the expensive tissue hypothesis comes in. It suggests that our brains took energy from the other bodily systems and shifted it towards brain growth, and the target of those budget cuts was our digestive system. A study published in 1995 found that not only are our brains bigger than what would be expected for our body size, our guts are much smaller than would be expected. Gut size and diet are correlated in mammals, with herbivores having a lot more digestive organ space than carnivores. Think about a cow's multiple stomachs for grass digestion versus a cheetah's naturally slim figure. And that's true in primates too. Primates that eat calorically dense foods like bugs, seeds, and berries have smaller guts than the ones that primarily eat leaves. Around the time that our brains started growing, humans also started using stone tools, which could have been used in hunting or as butcher knives. Basically, it became easier for our ancestors to eat meat, which is chock full of fat and calories. And a more calorie-dense diet means that less real estate and energy is needed to be devoted to digestion. So this hypothesis helps us address how we got our big brains. Now, let's talk about why. But first, all good research requires funding, so here's how we get ours.
This SciShow video is supported by JUMP, a statistical analysis software that makes powerful analytics quick and accessible. The process engineering suite in JUMP allows engineers to get a snapshot of performance across a range of charts, lets you set your own specifications to evaluate performance in the ways that matter to you, and helps you understand the impact your measurements have on your data. You can generate almost any type of process control chart in JUMP, from X-bar charts to P charts, so you can keep an eye on things every step of the way. It's all drag and drop, making quality monitoring as easy as adding an image to a document. And they offer a 30-day free trial for anyone, anywhere. You can find it at jmp.com/scishow.
Figuring out why we evolved any specific traits can be pretty messy, especially if the drivers of those traits are behavioral. We can make guesses about what our early ancestors were up to, but since behavior doesn't exactly fossilize, sometimes we're just taking shots in the dark. And a lot of the ideas for why we evolved big brains are behavioral. Several of the biggest hypotheses have to do with group living. In some ways, living in a big group of people is risky. When you're around more people, there's more competition for resources. The cultural intelligence hypothesis proposes that one of the advantages to living in a big group, though, is that it allows individuals to share information in a way that makes them more successful at obtaining resources. So you can teach each other things like how to use tools through imitation, and you can share knowledge of where the best troves of food or shelters are, so that knowledge spreads between group members and isn't lost between generations. And big brains are necessary for learning from each other and the social transmission of behavior, so they're worth the cost because they help groups to survive. On the other hand, the social brain hypothesis suggests that brain size isn't about shared knowledge, but shared behavior. The idea is that big brains help individuals come together to solve a shared problem cooperatively. That can be anything from grooming each other in big cliques to starting a violent fight against another group. But maintaining all of these social relationships takes a lot of cognitive effort. So big brains evolved because they favored social behaviors in ways that helped individuals accomplish specific tasks. Another set of hypotheses have to do with uncertain environments. The period of time when hominin brains started growing by leaps and bounds corresponds with the time with a lot of ecological change. About 2 million years ago, our ancestors started migrating out from Africa, and as they explored new places, they encountered new environments, climates, and geography. Then around 800,000 years ago, the Earth entered a period of pretty volatile climate change. During this period, our ancestors had to figure out new ways to find food sources on the fly, and bigger brains would have given them the flexibility and adaptability they needed to do that. So, bigger brains meant better odds at surviving this unpredictable environment. In some species of mammals, scientists have also observed a relationship between bigger brains and fewer fat stores. So, it could be that when food is hard to come by, having a big brain lets you figure out new ways to get food, instead of having to rely on stored energy in the form of fat. So, diverting energy to a bigger brain might be just as good for surviving lean times as packing on the pounds would be. There's evidence for and against all of these ideas, so in the end, we still don't know exactly what happened or what caused these changes. And to make matters even more complicated, there's some evidence that human brains have actually started shrinking in the last 3,000 years. Researchers have reported that in this time, human brains have shrunk by about 4 ping pong balls of volume. Some scientists have proposed that the shrinkage is due to warming climates, while others suggest that it's a product of living in big, complex social groups. Basically, living in a complex society allows individuals within it to develop specialized skills and promotes the division of labor. No one person had to do all jobs or have all the knowledge, so others can just kind of forget bits of information here and there. And relying on others in the community to hold on to some of that knowledge for you may mean that it's no longer worth the massive energy expenditure of fueling a brain that does all the things. Smaller brains use less energy, so we may actually be experiencing the expensive tissue hypothesis, but in reverse. That said, this paper has also gotten a bit of pushback, and some researchers suggest that the evidence for this alleged decrease in brain size isn't all that clear-cut. So after millions of years, we are still pondering exactly how we got these big brains with which we ponder such big questions. And whether our brains are shrinking or not, it's still pretty impressive that we have such sophisticated cognitive skills at all. Thanks to all you brainiacs for watching.